On a warm morning in July of 1982, 42-year-old Daniel Martinez woke up in his small apartment in San Jose, California. Next to him, his girlfriend Kathy slept with her head on his shoulder. Light poured in through the window, and it made Daniel groan, and he closed his eyes. He and Kathy had gotten high on heroin the night before, and now he felt way more hungover than usual. Daniel remembered that the heroin he had shot up last night burned like red-hot lava as he injected it into his vein. Within seconds, he had felt this amazing high, but along with the expected feelings of euphoria came hallucinations that left him stumbling around and bumping into things. It had also taken him a long time to come down and finally fall asleep. Daniel thought maybe that was why he was feeling so stiff that morning. As he tried to pry his arm out from under Kathy's head, his body felt super heavy. He had to pull his arm really hard, which woke Kathy up. And when Daniel told her how weird he was feeling, she said she felt stiff too. Then she pulled the covers back over her head to go back to sleep. Daniel wanted to lie back down too, but his parole officer told him if he didn't show up for his court appearance that morning, he'd be headed straight back to jail. And so, very slowly, Daniel pulled himself up and shuffled to the bathroom. An hour later, Daniel pulled into the parking lot of the county courthouse. The whole drive, Daniel had struggled just to turn the steering wheel of his old Volkswagen. Now that he was here, he knew he only had 10 minutes to register in the courtroom, so he tried to move quickly. But once he was out of his car, he could barely feel his feet as he walked towards the entrance. He felt so clumsy. It took him multiple tries just to drop his keys into the tray for the metal detector. Daniel did his best to look casual as he walked past the guard. But he stumbled as he passed by and had to grab the conveyor belt just to catch his balance. The guard looked at him suspiciously and asked Daniel if he was intoxicated. Daniel tried to explain that he was sober, but his tongue felt as numb as his feet, and so he slurred when he spoke. And so he was not surprised when the guard took his arm and told him he was under arrest for suspicion of being under the influence, which was a clear parole violation. Daniel knew he was headed to jail. Almost a week later, Daniel sat motionless on his bunk in jail, itching and burning where the weight of his body pressed into the thin mattress. For the past 6 days that he'd been in jail, Daniel had felt his body growing heavier and more rigid. It took him longer and longer to make it to the cafeteria line when it was time to eat, and even when he finally shuffled his way through the line, he dropped his tray at least once per meal. And so the guards started to bring his meals directly to his bunk, but eventually, Daniel couldn't even bend his arms to eat or drink. Finally, the guards brought him soup with a straw, but by that time, his mouth and jaws had started to lock up, and so he couldn't even eat. And on top of that, because his jaw was all locked up, he couldn't really speak. It was just a raspy gasp. Daniel didn't know what was more terrifying, the fact that he couldn't make his body move anymore, or the sinking feeling that nobody was coming to help him. As Daniel sat there motionless on his bed, he heard the heavy metallic sound of the guard's flashlight knocking on his cell door window. Daniel heard the guard then shout out 2 or 3 commands at him, but his body wouldn't respond, so he just sat there motionless. Then Daniel heard the heavy door slide open, and he heard the sound of the guard's boots walking towards him, and then Daniel saw the guard's face as he stared directly into Daniel's wide-open, unblinking eyes. Daniel watched as the hulking guard reached out and gently touched him on the shoulder. And because Daniel was so rigid and couldn't really move his body, as soon as the guard touched him, it was like he became a rocking chair. He just went back and forth on the bunk, more like a piece of wood than a human body. The guard took one more look into Daniel's eyes, and then a moment later pulled out his radio and called for medical help. Later that day, Dr. Owen Green examined the middle-aged man who now lay shackled to the gurney in the emergency room of the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center. Dr. Green checked his watch and noted that the man, Daniel Martinez, had stared straight ahead without blinking for at least 3 straight minutes, and the rest of his body was motionless too. And not just motionless, but frozen. Dr. Green could barely move the man's legs or arms without applying significant force. Dr. Green wondered if maybe Daniel had been given tranquilizers to keep him docile. So he ordered standard blood tests, and soon enough, he had the results. The tests found no tranquilizers in Daniel's system. Meanwhile, several hours had gone by, and Daniel's frozen state had not changed at all. So the doctor decided to run a few more tests just to make sure Daniel wasn't faking his symptoms to try to get out of jail. Dr. Green picked up the small hammer normally used to tap under a person's kneecap to test their reflexes. But instead of doing that, the doctor turned the hammer over and dragged the pointed side very firmly across the sole of Daniel's left foot. Now, normally, this would elicit a pretty big reaction. It's uncomfortable. But as he did it, Daniel stared straight ahead, giving no reaction. Next, the doctor took Daniel's right hand and dragged the hammer across his fingernails, jamming it into his nail beds. Most people cannot absorb that pain without reacting, but again, Daniel didn't even move. Dr. Green still was not entirely convinced that Daniel wasn't faking this, so he decided to try an extreme test. He asked the nurse to bring him a vial of ammonium carbonate, also known as smelling salts. He broke open the capsule and waved it directly under Daniel's nose. Now, most people, when exposed to smelling salts with it right under your nose, will instantly gasp for oxygen as their nose fills with the most irritating ammonia vapors. But Daniel didn't even cough. At this point, Dr. Green knew Daniel could not be faking his symptoms. Something was clearly very wrong with Daniel, and he needed to be seen by a specialist. A week later, Dr. Kenneth Schuster, the hospital's head of neurology, walked into an exam room to check up on Daniel. As Dr. Schuster entered the room, Daniel lay propped up in bed. He stared straight ahead, his mouth slightly open. His arms were bent and frozen at his sides. Dr. Schuster had been asked to help make sense of Daniel's symptoms. Many other doctors had tried to diagnose Daniel, but so far, nobody had an answer. By this point, Daniel basically could not speak at all, so as a result, it was impossible to get a clear medical history from him. And even though Dr. Schuster could see clear track marks on Daniel's arms, indicating a history of intravenous drug use, he didn't know of any drug, legal or otherwise, that could cause a man to freeze like this. So, the doctors could not agree whether Daniel's problems were from a psychological problem or caused by a physical condition. Now, the staff psychiatrist had diagnosed Daniel with something called catatonia, which is a condition where someone becomes rigid and mute after some sudden psychological crisis. Considering Daniel appeared to abuse drugs and did have a criminal history, it certainly was not out of the question that maybe he had suffered some kind of severe trauma at some point. But Dr. Schuster was not convinced that catatonia was the right diagnosis here. And so he decided to test this theory by testing Daniel for a particular symptom of catatonia, called waxy flexibility, in which patients can remain in uncomfortable positions indefinitely. Dr. Schuster gently pulled one of Daniel's stiff arms until it was straight over his head. Daniel's arm stayed frozen in the air for about 30 seconds until gravity began to pull it softly down. Dr. Schuster nodded as he timed the process. It took at least 3 minutes for the arm to fully come back down to rest. And so at this point, Dr. Schuster understood why the psychiatrist thought that this meant that Daniel was catatonic. But Dr. Schuster decided to perform some other tests that could show Daniel's problems were not purely psychological. He noticed that Daniel hadn't blinked at all since he had entered the room. And so Dr. Schuster tapped Daniel gently between the eyes. Even people with catatonia will eventually blink if they're tapped in this way, and Daniel did blink. However, most people will stop blinking, even if the tapping continues. But Daniel didn't. He just kept on blinking, which Dr. Schuster knew was a sign of brain damage. And then, after a while, Daniel's eyes suddenly slammed shut. Dr. Schuster asked Daniel to open them, and Daniel didn't. He just sat there with his eyes closed. Dr. Schuster was starting to see that Daniel had a problem in the part of his brain that controls movement. This meant that Daniel's frozen condition was likely caused by an injury or disease in his brain, not by psychological damage from a traumatic life event. Dr. Schuster instructed one of his colleagues, Dr. Ryan Curtis, to move Daniel to the neurobiology unit of the medical center for further treatment. But Dr. Schuster wasn't sure what that treatment would even be. As he ran through the lists of other tests he might want Dr. Curtis to perform, Dr. Schuster wondered how they could even help Daniel at this point. A week later, Dr. Curtis spooned some pudding into Daniel's mouth and watched him slowly swallow. Dr. Curtis had been personally helping feed Daniel the last few days, so it was easier for him to monitor his progress. With a week of around-the-clock hospital care, Daniel was better hydrated and his nutrition had improved. But the fact was, Daniel was still mostly silent, motionless, and frozen. When Dr. Curtis had finished feeding Daniel, he went to wash his hands in the sink. Afterward, as he stood there drying his hands, Dr. Curtis's eye caught a glint of light reflected on Daniel's fingernail. Then, another little flash from another fingernail. Slowly, faintly, Daniel's fingers were moving. Dr. Curtis realized Daniel was intentionally moving his fingers. This was not just a reflex. Dr. Curtis grabbed a pen from his pocket and a pad of paper from the nurse's station. Then he went over to Daniel and put the pen in his hand and began to wrap Daniel's fingers around the pen. And he was shocked when he saw Daniel begin to grip it. Once Daniel had the pen, Dr. Curtis asked Daniel to write his name on the pad. Slowly, Daniel's hand began to move over the page, and at first it just looked like a squiggly mark, but over the next 5 minutes, Daniel was able to slowly write out his name. Dr. Curtis called for Dr. Schuster to come witness Daniel's progress. Over the next half hour, the two doctors watched as Daniel wrote 3 more short lines. Daniel wrote that he was aware that his body was not working, but he didn't know why. Dr. Curtis was thrilled to see that Daniel's mind was working inside of his frozen body. And so as Dr. Curtis made a few notes of his own, Dr. Schuster began asking Daniel questions, and with each answer, he began to piece together a history of Daniel's health. And so Dr. Schuster asked Daniel to tell him what kind of medicine or drugs he was taking. And Daniel wrote one word in big letters: heroin. When he saw this, Dr. Curtis shook his head. He and Dr. Schuster both knew that heroin, as harmful as it was to the human body, couldn't cause the extreme symptoms Daniel was suffering from. So Dr. Schuster rephrased the question. Had Daniel been prescribed any medicine by a doctor? Dr. Curtis then helped Daniel hold the pad steady as Daniel scrawled one more shaky word: no. Over the next few hours, Dr. Curtis and Dr. Schuster put together the rest of Daniel's story. They went over every detail of the night 2 weeks earlier when Daniel's body first began to freeze. They covered the drugs, the hallucinations, everything. And then Daniel wrote down something that stopped both doctors in their tracks. Daniel wrote that his girlfriend, Kathy, had also woken up feeling stiff the same way Daniel had on that terrible morning this all began. But he hadn't seen or heard from Kathy since then. Dr. Schuster immediately rushed to the phone and called the police to request an immediate welfare check at Daniel's address. He could only hope that Kathy was still alive. Several days later, Dr. Schuster pulled into his parking space at the hospital and took the back elevator to the neurobiology unit. It was finally time to give Kathy an examination. When the police had done that welfare check at Daniel's apartment, Kathy had not been there. It would turn out she was staying with her family. However, it took Dr. Schuster making many phone calls to the family to convince them to bring Kathy to the hospital, even though they knew something was wrong with her. But eventually, her sister had finally brought her in, and today, the sister was by Kathy's side as Dr. Schuster entered the room. Immediately, Dr. Schuster could see that Kathy was in the same frozen state as Daniel was. Kathy's sister wiped Kathy's mouth with a cloth as she told the doctor how her sister had come home that morning 2 weeks ago, stumbling and slurring her speech. The family had rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors there had refused to admit her for what they assumed was drug intoxication. Kathy's sister was outraged, but she was afraid that if she made a scene, Kathy might be arrested, so she brought Kathy home. Since then, the entire family had taken care of Kathy around the clock and prayed she would just snap out of this. Dr. Schuster told the women that his best guess as to what was happening to Kathy, which also clearly was happening to Daniel, must have started on the same day, that whatever happened to both of them at the same time. Maybe they accidentally ate something toxic, a pesticide perhaps. Maybe there was a carbon monoxide leak in the furnace, or they had some other chemical exposure in Daniel's apartment. Dr. Schuster said he didn't want to rule anything out at this point. And so in order to figure out this mystery, Dr. Schuster convinced the sister to let him admit Kathy to the hospital. That way, at a minimum, she could get the basic care that she needed. A few days later, Dr. Curtis took the short drive down to Santa Cruz, where a fellow neurologist was throwing a party. Once he got inside, he was happy to see some old friends. But it wasn't long before he and his neurologist friend were back to talking medicine. Dr. Curtis wanted to discuss Daniel and Kathy's strange symptoms, but first, his friend wanted to tell Dr. Curtis about a strange case he was working on. He described 2 patients he had seen in a local emergency room the week before. They were brothers who lived in Watsonville, about 50 miles from San Jose. They were 2 healthy young men in their 20s who had been found in their apartment by their mother. Both men were completely frozen, unable to move or talk. Dr. Curtis couldn't believe what he was hearing. His friend was describing Daniel and Kathy's symptoms exactly. He found himself nodding when his friend said that he thought these 2 brothers had the symptoms of a neurological disease called Parkinson's, which can make muscles rigid and slow-moving. Dr. Curtis had discussed the possibility of Parkinson's with Dr. Schuster, but they both agreed that a Parkinson's diagnosis could not possibly be correct for Daniel and Kathy. Parkinson's develops slowly, and Daniel and Kathy had gotten sick literally overnight. What's more, Parkinson's disease is not contagious, but both Daniel and Kathy fell ill at the exact same time. So diagnosing Daniel and Kathy with Parkinson's, it just didn't make any sense. Dr. Curtis's friend felt the same way about his 2 patients. Then he added an odd detail about these 2 brothers that he found interesting, although he didn't know if it was related to the disease they were suffering from. He said both of the brothers were longtime heroin users. Dr. Curtis knew that Daniel and Kathy were also heroin users, but he'd never heard of heroin making people frozen. But 4 frozen heroin addicts could not be a coincidence. Even though it was very late, he asked his friend for the phone and called Dr. Schuster immediately. After sharing this new information with Dr. Schuster, Dr. Curtis could hear the concern rising in his colleague's voice as he made the link. What if a poisoned batch of heroin was circulating around Northern California and it somehow caused these Parkinson's-like symptoms? If the heroin was to blame, they could have a serious public health disaster on their hands. First, they needed to track down some heroin from the same batch and test it right away. And second, they had to warn heroin users that there could be a deadly poison on the streets. A week later, Dr. Schuster flipped through Daniel Martinez's medical records one more time as he sat on hold with the San Jose Police Crime Lab. As a headache began to settle in between his eyes, he caught a glimpse of his face reflected in the small window of his office. It was late, and he looked as tired as he felt. He hadn't gotten a full night's sleep since Dr. Curtis woke him up last week with the news about the 2 frozen brothers. After the hospital put out a press release about the potentially poisoned drugs, the local media had picked up the story. By the end of the week, Dr. Schuster had found himself in a room full of cameras explaining the situation to reporters from all over the state. As a result of all this coverage, 2 other cases had been discovered, bringing the total number of frozen patients to 6. In between seeing patients and running the clinic, Dr. Schuster had acquired samples of the heroin each of the patients had injected, and sent the samples to the crime lab for analysis. Just then, the hold music paused, and Dr. Schuster finally heard the familiar voice of the crime lab's lead toxicologist, Sabrina Davis. As Sabrina read the test results, Dr. Schuster sat up in his chair, completely stunned. She told him all 6 patients had injected the exact same chemical, but that chemical was not heroin. However, she said she wasn't actually sure what this chemical was, and it would take time to figure that out. Dr. Schuster thanked Sabrina for all the hard work and asked her to keep on searching. And he was about to hang up the phone when Sabrina suddenly said she had one more idea. She suggested that he track down an article in an obscure medical journal that reminded her of this case. It described a college student from the 1970s who had been found paralyzed in his parents' basement in Bethesda, Maryland. Dr. Schuster jotted down the name of the journal, thanked Sabrina again, and then hung up the phone. The next day, Dr. Schuster found a copy of the article, and after he finished reading it, he finally understood what was happening to these 6 frozen patients, and the answer had been staring them in the face the whole time. It would turn out Daniel, Kathy, and the 4 other frozen patients had all been poisoned by a bad batch of something that was brand new at the time: synthetic heroin. Synthetic street drugs were so unusual that the drug compounds were written about in medical journals like the one Sabrina suggested to Dr. Schuster. That article described the case of a college student who was trying to cook up fake heroin, a compound called MPPP. When the amateur chemist heated the compound at too high a temperature, the heat changed it into a different compound called MPTP. When he injected this bad batch of fake heroin, he froze up and couldn't move. All the symptoms of advanced Parkinson's disease. Daniel, Kathy, and the rest of the other frozen patients got a batch of the same kind of overheated fake heroin. When they injected it, this faulty chemical wreaked havoc on their brains, causing them to develop the same Parkinson's-like symptoms overnight. People with Parkinson's lose certain brain cells that control the brain's ability to produce a crucial chemical called dopamine. Dopamine delivers the brain's messages to the nervous system, telling the body how to move. Without dopamine, people cannot move at all. Usually, it takes Parkinson's victims years for enough of these cells to die off before they notice a change in their motor functions. But scientists found that the fake heroin chemical, MPTP, was able to destroy these brain cells within a week. While there's no cure for Parkinson's, Daniel and the rest of the patients were thankfully able to be treated. They were given a compound called L-Dopa, a medicine that increases the dopamine in the brain, and after just one dose, they were already able to start moving their bodies normally again. However, L-Dopa treatment comes with many side effects, and unfortunately, none of the frozen patients made a total recovery. But there was a silver lining to this case. The discovery of this bad batch of heroin, the MPTP compound, for the first time gave researchers a substance that could reliably create a Parkinson's-like effect in a lab setting. Now, scientists can accurately test for new drugs on animals and get them to market much faster. And so as a result, what happened to these 6 people has led to enormous advances in Parkinson's research. Just before Thanksgiving in November of 1987, 37-year-old Beth Sternlieb stopped to steady herself against a water fountain in a hospital hallway. A slim, strong woman with a bob of blonde hair, she was due to give birth to her second son very soon. The surges of pain were excruciating and growing stronger. Beth's husband, Greg, helped her shuffle along the corridor, trying to distract her in conversation. But the spasms she was experiencing were too intense to ignore. Beth's career as a yoga and meditation teacher at the nearby University of California at Los Angeles had taught her lots of strategies for coping with pain. But childbirth was testing her limits. Greg stroked Beth's hand and suggested she picture a perfect day with their whole family, at a beautiful beach in Malibu or maybe a scenic hike in the hills. Beth relaxed a little while visualizing each scene until one powerful contraction scrambled her thoughts. It was so strong, she knew it could only mean one thing. Before she even realized what was happening, Beth was being eased into a wheelchair as Greg and a nurse rushed her down the hall. Everything was a blur of fluorescent lights and gleaming hallway floors until they were pushing through swinging doors into a delivery room. Hours later, drenched in sweat and her muscles aching from furious pushing, Beth suddenly heard the most magical sound, her baby crying. When the doctor finally placed the bundled-up tiny pink infant onto her chest, Beth gazed down at his sweet little face and smiled. All the pain and all the effort had been worth it, and now she was just looking forward to getting some rest. But a couple of weeks later, as Beth slumped in a chair in her doctor's office, she somehow felt even worse than right after delivering her baby. After the birth of her first child a few years ago, Beth had experienced typical postpartum aches and pains, but this time was different. Her primary physician, Dr. Shay Mitchell, listened intently as Beth told him what was going on. For a few days now, her head had throbbed with a dull, deep pain, her muscles ached, and her bowels had been churning. Her entire biological system felt under attack from top to bottom. No matter how many naps she took or how healthy a diet she ate, Beth felt wrecked. Dr. Mitchell nodded as Beth described what she'd been going through. Afterwards, he reviewed her medical chart and the vitals his nurse had taken when Beth first arrived. Then he took a seat on a stool facing Beth and told her not to worry too much. Her recovery from the pregnancy was actually proceeding at a healthy rate. However, he said that, this winter had been one of the worst flu seasons in Los Angeles that Dr. Mitchell had ever seen. So more than likely, Beth had just caught a bug that was a bit more stubborn than usual. And so he advised her to rest as much as she could and to drink lots of fluids. This was traditional advice, but hydration and rest would boost her body's strength to fight off whatever infection was causing her symptoms. If she stuck to this regimen for a while, Dr. Mitchell felt sure that Beth would soon be on the mend. Back at home, Beth told her husband that according to Dr. Mitchell, she very likely had the flu. Greg thought that made sense and offered to cover as much extra childcare as necessary to help his wife get back on her feet. Later that day, once the baby was down for a nap, Greg took their toddler out for a walk in the winter sun, while Beth retreated to the bedroom, closed the curtains, and crawled under the covers. When she woke up a couple of hours later to the sound of Greg and their toddler laughing in the front yard, she already felt better. Beth felt confident that her body would find its way back to health. It just needed time. But one afternoon, 6 months later, after a long shift at the UCLA Meditation Center, Beth felt unusually drained and went to rest in her office. Her postpartum flu-like sickness was long gone, but she'd been feeling run down the past couple of days. Around mid-morning, a headache had crept in and never left. By mid-afternoon, her body felt sore and limp, and she couldn't focus. Sitting in her office chair, Beth rested her head on the desk and rubbed her stomach, trying her best to ease the pain in her gut. As she did, she lifted her shirt and noticed something. A scattering of tiny dots all over her torso. Fortunately, they didn't itch or sting, but they were odd and new, which worried her. Later that night, Beth checked her stomach again before getting into the shower. And to her shock, the dots had multiplied and spread. Now her entire stomach was a solid block of red, like a really bad sunburn. Beth decided it was definitely time to make another appointment with Dr. Mitchell. A few days later, on a hot summer morning, Greg took the morning off of work to watch the baby while Beth went to the clinic. She felt woozy and bleached out by the sun as she crossed the parking lot and marched up the front steps into the building. Once inside of Dr. Mitchell's office, Beth raised her shirt to show him the thick red splotch across her stomach. And under the fluorescent lights, they looked even more severe. Dr. Mitchell studied the rash's texture and traced the tendrils to where it had spread the farthest. After a few moments, he stood back and shook his head. He admitted that he wasn't sure what it was, but his guess was some type of hives, which are usually caused by an allergic reaction. Beth didn't have any specific allergies that she knew of, but Dr. Mitchell told her that allergies can start any time in a person's life, for all sorts of reasons. Dr. Mitchell also said it was possible that Beth might have an autoimmune disease like psoriasis, which can cause severe rashes. He explained that autoimmune diseases are basically like the body having an allergic reaction to itself. Dr. Mitchell wrote down the name and number of a colleague who specialized in autoimmune disorders and gave it to Beth. If anybody could find out what was going on with her skin, it would be him. But unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. Early the next week, Beth made an appointment with the doctor, had blood drawn for multiple tests, then waited several days for a response. But when the call finally came, the doctor had disappointing news. All the tests were inconclusive. He told Beth that her results suggested the presence of some sort of autoimmune disorder, but there was not enough data to determine anything more specific. Beth felt frustrated and tired of this runaround with her health, but the red rash on her stomach had faded, along with the rest of her symptoms. So Beth shrugged it off and refocused on her work and family. Her baby and toddler were growing up quickly, and she wanted to savor every day of it. One spring morning, about 4 years later, Beth's bedroom door burst open as both her kids tumbled onto the bed, hungry for breakfast. Her oldest was in elementary school, and her youngest was almost in kindergarten. Greg play wrestled with both of them as Beth slipped out of bed and went into the kitchen to start the coffee. But as she did, she noticed her head felt hazy. Last night, Greg had arranged a dinner party to celebrate Beth's return from a work trip, so they had stayed up late drinking wine and socializing. Now she felt like she was paying for it. As the coffee brewed, Beth rubbed her temples and pictured the long, busy workday ahead of her. Her kids seemed to have more energy every day, so juggling motherhood with a full-time job was not getting any easier, and having a slight hangover made it even worse. After feeding the kids breakfast, Beth got dressed and went to the bathroom to freshen up. Standing in front of the mirror, something familiar caught her eye. A rash of tiny red dots across her stomach. Beth's heart sank. The rash and the accompanying sickness came back a few times every year. But it had been about 6 months since the last time, so Beth had hoped that this time it might be gone for good. Later that morning, Beth was in the middle of a meditation class when her stomach lurched. She told her students to continue without her, and then she rushed to the bathroom. That day, all her familiar symptoms returned: the headache, the muscular pains, and the cramps. As she drove home through rush hour traffic after work, Beth felt overwhelmed and defeated. All her life, she had considered herself blessed to be a naturally healthy person. But something had changed after her second pregnancy. She still didn't understand what it was, but it was clear that this sickness, whatever it was, wasn't going away anytime soon. That night after dinner, Beth discussed the situation with Greg. She admitted that she had been feeling spread thin lately. The kids required so much energy, and her work had been tougher this semester. But, even so, Beth was confused how stress alone could be responsible for her recurring symptoms. Feeling generally run down was totally normal for any working parent, but pounding headaches and diarrhea and mysterious rashes were not. While Greg washed the dishes, Beth went to their bedroom to meditate. Sitting in the lotus position on her yoga mat with candles lit, Beth tried to block out stressful thoughts. She focused on breathing evenly, letting her body settle into a sense of calm. But worries kept nagging her, that these symptoms would keep coming back forever, and they would get worse as she got older, and maybe one day she'd be too weak and tired to fight them off. Beth gave up on meditation, opened her eyes, blew out the candles, and climbed into bed. Greg came in later and sat next to her. He suggested that Beth call in sick tomorrow and spend the day looking for new doctors. There had to be some medical professional out there who could figure out what was going on with her. Beth was grateful to have such a supportive partner and agreed to Greg's suggestion. But the next day started a trend that would go on for years. Calling various clinics, talking to all sorts of doctors, taking tests, and waiting for results. Yet nobody was able to determine what was causing her symptoms, so her symptoms just kept on returning. Every 5 or 6 months, the illness would return and knock Beth out for a week and then subside. Gradually, Beth learned to coexist with it. She had no other choice. Then came the summer of 2005. One hot day in late August of that year, Beth crouched in the living room surrounded by boxes, helping her son finish packing for college. It felt joyous and surreal, but also sad. Her youngest was now 18 and leaving the next morning to move into his freshman dorm. Beth had intended to go with him and help him get settled, but she'd woken up with an intense fever a few days ago and still felt too weak to make the drive. Her rash had also returned. This time, worse than ever, covering her entire torso and up her neck. But it was the fever that really worried her. It had spiked a few times at 104. Beth tossed and turned through the nights, drenched in sweat. During the days, she felt too sick and exhausted to eat, and fought to keep her eyes open. She had not been to work even once this week. Beth did visit her most recent doctor, who ran some tests and discovered that her white blood cell count was high, proving she had an infection of some sort. But, as always, he still had no answers as to what was making her sick. Once the boxes were all packed and taped, her son left to go meet up with some friends, and as soon as the door closed, Beth felt her body shut down. She always tried to put on a brave face in front of her kids, but inside, she was losing it. Beth had been battling this sickness for 18 long years. No matter how much she took care of herself or how proactive she was about seeing doctors, nothing had improved. Every 6 months, it came back like clockwork, and now it had returned with a vengeance. Her husband tried to stay optimistic, but she could tell he was beaten down by this too. This was not the life they had imagined together years ago when they started a family. Beth went to the bedroom, drew the blinds, and buried herself in the covers. She tried once again to rest and unwind, but she was getting tired of pretending that things would change. At the back of her mind lurked a dark thought. Was she doomed to live like this forever? 5 months later, Beth was lying on her back in a hospital room, waiting to be slid inside the big white donut of a CT scan machine. The past few months had been Beth's worst yet. Her fatigue had intensified to the point that she had to arrange an indefinite leave of absence from work. Beth's job was her passion, and without it, she fell into a depression, spending entire days in bed or on the couch. She barely ate or left the house. Over a couple of months of this gloomy routine, Beth lost 15 pounds, which only made her weaker. But, despite all this, Beth was still a fighter. She hadn't given up hope of finding someone who could help. Her latest doctor, Dr. William Bruce, specialized in infectious diseases, and over the past month, he tested Beth for a number of possible causes for her sickness, including malaria, parasitic infections, autoimmune diseases, and even HIV and hepatitis. One by one, they were all ruled out. So now, Dr. Bruce had ordered a CT scan to see if Beth might have some sort of internal injury or intrusive growth. Once the CT scan machine was prepared, a nurse slid Beth into the center cavity and then left the room. Beth lay there and listened to the mechanical hum, letting her mind wander. She had been through too much at this point to let her hopes rise very high, but a part of her stayed optimistic. About 15 minutes later, the machine powered down and the nurse returned and wheeled Beth out. A few minutes after that, Dr. Bruce entered and told Beth he would call her with the results as soon as they were ready, most likely in a day or two. The next 48 hours seemed to crawl by until finally, early one afternoon, while Beth sat on the couch under a blanket, her phone rang. It was the hospital. Her CT scan results had come in. Beth listened tensely as a nurse explained that the doctor had discovered 8 fibroids in her uterus. Now, by itself, that was not so shocking. Small uterine fibroids are common in women over 40, and they're very rarely cancerous. But one of Beth's fibroids was abnormally large, which could spell trouble. Fibroids tend to swell when they lose their blood supply and begin to die, which can lead to complications. The hospital gave Beth the phone number of a gynecologist, Dr. Jessica Schneider. They recommended that she call Dr. Schneider first thing in the morning to treat the issue. Beth promised she would, hung up, and went to tell her husband. Beth wasn't sure what to make of all this news yet, but she couldn't help but feel optimistic about the discovery. Was this really it? Was this the source of 18 years of sickness? Later that week, Dr. Jessica Schneider sat across from Beth in her office and told her she would need surgery. Beth nodded slowly with a look of resignation, like she'd somehow been expecting this. This was Dr. Schneider's third consultation with Beth. Over the course of their meetings, she had grown fond of her patient. Despite Beth's soft-spoken manner, she was clearly tough and resilient. Even so, this illness had obviously taken a toll. Beth's warm smile looked tired, and her eyes were ringed with dark circles. Dr. Schneider didn't want to add to Beth's struggles, but she knew surgery was a must. Over her years as a gynecologist, she had encountered fibroids many times and knew what to watch out for. When fibroids die, they often get big very quickly, and there was always a chance that any of Beth's fibroids could be cancerous. Dr. Schneider booked Beth's surgery for a couple weeks away in December and warned Beth that it was possible the fibroids were not the cause of all her sickness. If so, the surgery wouldn't change anything, but it was worth a shot.
Anlamsız geldi her şey uzaktan bakınca kendime varınca kolay olmadı böyle terk etmek seni ama anla sen de beni. Her şeyi yaktın bu gece, bir görseydin beni şimdi. Şeyi yaktın bu gece, bir görseydin beni.
After the surgery, once Beth was stitched up and wheeled out of the operating room, Dr. Schneider scooted her stool in front of a stainless steel surgical tray and looked down upon the largest fibroid she had ever seen in her career. It was about the size of a grapefruit, 4 inches across. Dr. Schneider shook her head in shock as she thought of Beth carrying that enormous thing around inside of her. Poking it with her surgical ruler, Dr. Schneider was surprised by the fibroid's consistency. Normally, fibroids are dense, like little balls of muscle. This one was strangely springy and swollen. Dr. Schneider picked up a scalpel from her surgeon's toolkit and gently pressed the blade into the flesh of the fibroid. As soon as the tip pierced the skin, white pus exploded onto her hand. Slicing deeper, Dr. Schneider could not believe what she was seeing. The fibroid was like a rotten dumpling, filled to the brim with infected liquid. In all her years of study and practice, Dr. Schneider had never seen or heard of a fibroid like this. She quickly placed it in a sterile container and then hurried to have it tested by the lab. Dr. Schneider didn't know for sure, but every medical instinct in her body pointed the same direction. Whatever it was in this giant fibroid had to be the thing that had been making Beth sick. Days later, Dr. Schneider's phone rang with the report she had been waiting for, and with it, the explanation for Beth's long illness. Beth's fibroid was not cancerous, but it had been incredibly bad for her. The pus inside of Beth's fibroid was absolutely teeming with an unidentified strain of Salmonella bacteria. And, as far as the lab could tell, this Salmonella had been festering inside of Beth for a long time. Possibly as far back as 1987, when Beth gave birth to her second child. For 18 years, Beth had been suffering from a simmering Salmonella infection that sometimes boiled over and caused her terrible cramps, rashes, and all the other debilitating symptoms. With the source of the infection removed, Beth's body could finally recover. Now, only one final question remained. How had she contracted the bacteria? Several months later, Beth was at home when there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a public health nurse bearing unusual news. The hospital had kept testing the Salmonella from Beth's fibroid, searching for a match, until they finally found one. Hers was not the Salmonella commonly found in contaminated or undercooked food, but instead was a Salmonella strain only found in reptiles. Beth was blown away. Her kids had never once owned a pet reptile, and as far as she knew, there had never been a reptile in their house before. She had no idea how anyone in her family would have even been around one. Though Beth never got an official explanation for how she caught this reptilian strain of Salmonella, her doctors suspected that she contracted it while in the hospital for the birth of her second child. All it would have taken is one employee or patient with a pet turtle or frog or lizard who didn't properly wash their hands to touch something that Beth later touched as well. A doorknob, a railing, a water fountain. After that, the disease took shelter in a uterine fibroid where it would periodically escape into her bloodstream, causing her repeated bouts of illness. After her surgery, Beth never suffered from another episode of her terrible rash or other symptoms ever again. She returned to teaching mindfulness and yoga full-time with a deeper appreciation for health than ever before. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories. They are all inspired by true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Our senior managing producer is Nick Ryan, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson.